What is up, YouTube? It is Alicia and we are back with another video. This is week 2 of our 30-day Azure DevOps challenge. For those of you who are following along, you know we started this thing off on the AWS side, and now we are building these same projects out in Azure using different NBA APIs to help you guys understand various Azure services and how we can build out projects. Really, the goal is for you to be committing this stuff to your GitHub. If you can't tell by the ambiance, it is post-Valentine's Day. This one balloon is so deflated and sad, but the other ones held up pretty strong. They're still floating. But I thought it'd be cool decor. Hopefully it's not too distracting. Y'all let me know in the comments how y'all feel about Valentine's Day. Like, are you someone who loves to celebrate it? Do you go above and beyond? You know, is it just another day for you? Did you participate in Galentine's? Let me know what it looked like for you. And we can probably talk about that in another video. But anyways, let's get into today's challenge. Today we are going to be building out an NBA or NCAA in this case highlight processor. We'll be going out and finding video highlights from clips from live games, and we are going to be then uploading or downloading those videos into our Azure storage ecosystem. So I'm super excited about this one. Let's just jump straight into the computer and get straight to it. Okay, because we love a good technical diagram. Let's go ahead and get straight into it. So this is kind of like a flow of how things are moving from Azure to the API. So let's read this thing from left to right. So first and foremost, the first thing that has to happen is we're going to create an HTTP request where we go to this API and grab data. Now, if you haven't been following along and you're a little rusty on APIs, I'll link some videos below that explain them. But for the sake of a high level understanding right here, an API essentially is an endpoint where we can go and grab data from. So it is like a third party or something outside of our ecosystem where the data is stored, but they'll publish an endpoint so we can go and talk to that and say, hey, I want to access this various information that you have stored, right? So we do that API request. And then what happens is it's injected into our Azure storage account in a container that we call an Azure Blob Storage. So the best way to think about what's happening right here is to really think about a folder structure on your computer, right? You might have like a C drive that has like your user information, like Alicia as an example. And then if you double click that, it might have some of like my desktop or my like documents. And then if you double click into documents, then it might have specific folders that I have saved that talk about these projects that we're doing here, right? So with each click, you're kind of stepping deeper into a folder or through a path, right? And that's essentially what's happening here. That information is then put into this blob storage in a JSON format. And we're going to open this up and show you guys what this looks like. But for those of you who haven't worked with JSON, essentially what this means is that it is just a text file that has a bunch of different gibberish in it, for lack of better words, right? It could have, URLs, player information, player IDs, just various things that are separated by like in JSON format. So since that's not something that we can do anything with, we have to actually say, okay, how can you parse this JSON file, or how can you comb through this JSON file to find videos specifically that we want to download and save, right? So all of that happens down here in memory, right? We take that JSON file, we parse it through HTTP, and we pull out any of the video URLs that are in there. We go to those URLs, and then we download that specific video. So it's going to make a little bit more sense once we actually show the data within the file. But okay, we have a text file. Within that text file, we sort through it and comb through it for URLs to videos. We go to that website, we download the video, and then we place it back into Azure Blob Storage underneath of a different folder, right? So it'll still be within the same blob or within the same container, but it'll have separated paths, one for our JSON file and one for our processed videos, right? And all of that is happening within Azure. Now, for those of you who have been doing the AWS labs, I know some of you guys have gotten stumped with the whole IAM or the access management or the permissions part of it. Luckily, this is a lot more seamless here in Azure. I'll show you guys when we jump in the code. But as you can see down here, Intra ID, that is how we are authenticating to talk to all of these various services. This was previously called Azure Active Directory. So if you're watching anything or reading old documentation and they use that, that is one in the same. But that covers kind of like our technical diagram. Let's jump into now our documentation and our actual lab projects. So underneath of our Azure 30-day DevOps challenge, you'll see projects. We are now in week 2, and you'll see Azure Highlight Processor, right? Now within that, we have 2 things. Our source folder is going to be where we're storing all of our scripts and all of our code that is primarily written in Python. And then we have our instructions documentation here, right? So one for source, one for instructions. Now let's just step through each file and talk about what it's actually doing. So we're starting off with our .env file. This is our environment variable file. And what this is doing here is these are just where we can kind of code any variables that will pull within our scripts. So that way we only have to make these updates in one spot and then it can pull it in. So the first thing that you see here, you don't have to change this. This is the API URL or the URL that we'll be using to fetch the basketball highlights. Our rapid API underscore host is the host for the API service itself. So you won't have to change that either. But where you will have to make an update is right here. You want to paste in your API key. This is what you're going to use to authenticate any request. So I'll show you guys how to get that set up when we get into the instructions and in the documentation. Another thing that you're going to have to update here is your Azure subscription ID. And then you're going to want to have to come up with a unique resource group that you want to use for this project. I typically create resource groups that follow the name of my projects. That way I know like when it's time to clean up what I can delete and what isn't important. But you want to make sure that is unique. If you are using an existing resource group, that is okay as well. In the script, it checks it to see if that resource group exists. And if not, then it will create it. And for a location, we are using US East 2. Another thing that stumped a lot of people up, or a few people, not a lot of people, last week is actually the spacing. You want to make sure that there are no spaces in between this equal sign and whatever you're typing. A few people got error messages because of that. Now, if you move down here to line 13, 14, and 15, well, really 14 and 15 specifically, you will see that these lines are actually blank. That is because in another file, we are going to populate a new storage account name and a new storage account key. So this is going to be dynamically updated. So we want to keep that empty. That is important to note that if you run this multiple times, like after you run this the first time, it's actually going to inject the key and the name here. So if you want to like recreate it with something different, you want to make sure you come back and delete that, save it, and then rerun it. Like I said, the goal of this is just to create a project where you can start to understand the resources. This is like us creating a Toyota right now. Eventually, we'll create a Ferrari that has all the bells and whistles. But I didn't want to automate a bunch of stuff and then you don't understand what's really going on behind the wood because you don't take the time to like the wood going on behind the hood because you don't take the time to understand it. But last but not least, you're going to create an Azure container name. And I'll show you all some of the parameters we have set within the code to ensure that this returns things that won't give you an error message, like proper characters, numbers, letters, dashes, etc., whatever. But cool. Underneath of the fetch parameters here, this is also going to be something that you don't have to worry about changing. This date is looking for a static date and time. A modification you could do is to update this to dynamically check for a date, right? Maybe it's the middle of NCAA season and, you know, games are hosted on specific days. You can fetch that based on a date and a time and automate that. We are using NCAA for this example because it is free. If you want to get NBA highlights, they are there at this rapid API key. You just have to upgrade your tier and replace that with the proper league name. And then we're just going to limit how much data we're fetching because we don't really want to process a whole lot of data. We just want enough to, you know, do a proof of concept, if you will. Now we have some input and output keys. This is going to be the blob path where the JSON data will be stored when we pull it from the API. Remember, we said we're going to go out to the website or go to the API and pull down that JSON file that's just like text. And then after we process it, right, go to the URL and download it. This is the output key, or where the blob path will be processed, where the process videos will be saved. So another thing that we have right here is a retry count. So this is the amount of times that you can retry to create something if we experience any errors. And then last but not least, we have a delay within retries. So it gives us a little bit of buffer time in seconds and then a wait time in between running each script. We want to make sure that we give time for things to stabilize. So right at 60 seconds, that means that like in between each script running, there will be about like a 1 minute break to ensure that like all those resources are there and pretty much avoid any potential errors. So all of that is information that we input, and then it is pulled into our files, right? So let's jump into our fetch.py, since that is, no, actually fetch.py isn't, it's the first part of the pipeline, but there are some things that need to happen before. Let's jump down to create a storage account.py. So what is going on here at the top? First and foremost, we are importing some various things. We're going to import the OS for environment variables and file operations. We're going to import string for string constants. This is used when we're randomly generating things. We're going to import random for generating random strings. We're going to import the default Azure credential for Azure authentication. We're going to import our storage management for managing our storage accounts. And then last but not least on the import, we are importing our resource management client for managing our resource groups. So stepping into the different functions that we have here, this is going to generate a random storage account that conforms to the Azure naming rules. So it has to be between 3 and 24 characters, and it has to be lowercase and numbers only. So this is what is going to be dynamically ingested back into that .env file that we saw previously that we just went through, right? So now this next function is going to, like we said, update that env file with newly created storage account name and key. So it's going to go find the file .env. It's going to look for a list to hold the updated lines. And then it's going to then read all of those lines from the .env file and flag to track if account line is found, and then a flag to track if a account key line is found. Now, after that, it's going to then, with this statement here, replace the line with a new storage account name. And then it's going to, down here, replace the line with the new storage account key. If not, right, in this else statement, then it's going to keep other lines unchanged. Down here is appending if not found for the storage account name, and then appending if not found for the account key itself. And then we have a write new lines, which is going to write the updated lines back to the .env file and print out that the env file was updated with the storage account. This is going to be important. It's going to output this in our terminal. This is going to be important because we want to confirm that our contents made it to that storage account. So this will help us figure out where we need to go and look for that specifically. Now, our next function that we have is going to create a storage account. So this is going to go and retrieve a bunch of different stuff, Azure configuration values from the environment variable. So it's going to look for our subscription ID, resource group, location, etc. And then it's going to ensure that the subscription ID and the resource group are set right here. We're going to use this credential to authenticate with using Azure, using default Azure credential. And then we are going to create a resource group to manage those resources. So if this resource group already exists, then it doesn't need to create it. But if not, it's going to create it and say that it is ready. Now that we have our resource group, the next thing that we want to do is create our storage account, right? So we're going to create a storage management client to manage those storage account. Then we're going to make sure that it generates a valid storage account name. And then it's going to print out that it was created in whatever resource group at whatever location is specified. Now we're going to begin creating a storage account with the specified parameters. So this is going to use, this line right here is going to use standard locally redundant storage. That's what standard LRS stands for. And then the kind is going to be a storage v2 that specifies the storage account kind that we'll be using. So if you want to update any of that information, you can do that within here. Obviously, if we were doing this at a production level, we wouldn't want to place that information here, but it's okay for the level that we're operating at right now. And then so this is going to wait for the storage account creation to finish, and then it's going to print out that the storage account was created. Now, last but not least, we need to retrieve the primary key for the new storage account itself, right? So this line right here is going to go and find the primary key, key 1, among the return keys. And then if not, it's going to say that it could not retrieve them. Lastly, it goes and update the .env file with the new storage account details. So the storage account name and the primary key itself. And then this if underscore name equals, in quotes, underscore main underscore. This is when the script runs directly, create the new storage account that you can see here. So this is essentially everything with creating the proper storage accounts, creating the keys, and updating that .env file itself. That is one of the first pieces that has to get executed. We also have our config.py. And up here we import the same thing. We already talked about OS to work with environment variables. And then this line right here is going to import load underscore .env to load variables from a .env file specifically. Now, an important thing to note right here is that we force the reloading of environment variables from .env file, even if they already exist in the environment. This is important because, like, if you are going and changing that storage account name and that key, right? So you delete it to rerun it and dynamically generate new ones. You want to make sure that it's pulling in that new information. So this will just make sure that it is constantly overriding. It is essentially the same as you manually restarting your terminal or opening a new terminal to run these things. But pretty straightforward. It is just going and pulling these from the .env file that we talked about. So nothing really new here or exciting. Just going and importing those various things. So now we can go ahead and start the actual process of everything with fetch.py. Like I said, this is the actual line of code that's going to go out and grab things. So we're going to import the JSON module first to work with our JSON data. Remember, when we pull that down from the API, it's going to be in a JSON format. Then we're going to import requests to make those HTTP requests. That's how we actually go out and talk to the API to get the data. And then we're going to, from the config file, we're going to import the following variables. So last but not least, we're going to import blob service client to interact with Azure blob storage. So stepping into the actual functions of what happens, this right here is going to actually set up query parameters for the API request. So when we go out and say, hey, go get this information, it's going to say, get this information at this date, at this lead time. That gives us a limit, the maximum number of highlights that we're interested in fetching. And then so down here in the headers, this is where we set up headers required by Rapid API for authentication. So this is where you say, hey, this is who I am who I say I am, give me access to this data, right? And in here, this is where we make a GET request to the API endpoint with the provided headers and the query parameters that we specified above. This response right here, raise for status, this will raise an error for bad requests. So anything that is non-200 code. And then this right here parses the JSON response into a Python dictionary itself. And then it will print highlights fetched successfully. If not, it will follow this except and print error fetching highlights. So now that we've gone out and gotten the data, the next step is we want to save it to a blob. So this connection string right here, this is going to build, well, all of this. This is going to build the connection string for Azure Blob Storage using the provided account name and key that was dynamically created. And then down here on line 46, we are going to create a blob service client instance using that connection string itself. Now for the container name, container client, for the container name line on 49, we are going to convert that container name into lowercase because Azure requires lowercase container name. So if it gave us something with capitalization, we are going to make sure that it is lower. And then we are going to get a client to interact with the specified container. Now this checks to see if the container exists. If not, it will actually create it right here in this file. And then that's why you might see container exists, get output. And then this is going to construct the blob name or the path where the JSON data will be stored. So highlights injecting the file name here, .json is where that will be stored. And this is going to get a client for that specific blob, and then we're going to upload that JSON data converted to a string to the blob, and it's going to overwrite it if that file already exists. So if you were to run this once and then run it again to the same blob, it'll just overwrite that existing file without any versioning, so you won't be able to see the first file you did. But if you want to go and like update the dates of that static date, you could go ahead and do that. And then boom, process highlight. So this is going to indicate that the fetch process is starting. This is going to fetch the highlights from the API. And this is going to print that it's saving the highlights to the blob storage. And then this is going to save the fetch highlights to the blob storage. So this is going out and just handling essentially all of, whoa, clicking on a lot of things I should not be. This is going to go out and handle essentially all of this first left portion, right? Going to get the JSON file from the Rapid API endpoint. So let's jump to process one video, because now that we have the JSON file, we want to actually be able to go through and download one video. So on process1video.py, same thing up here. We have our import for parsing the JSON data, handling requests. This import from IO, import bytes IO. Sorry. This is going to handle any binary data that we have in our memory. This is going to pull in all of those things from our config file. And then last but not least, blob service client for our Azure blob service operations. So let's step into the specific functions. So for, we're going to try to, once again, build that connection string right here. It's going to create that blob service client for using the connection string. And then it's going to get a client for the container and ensure the container name is lowercase. It's going to print that it's fetching the JSON file from that Azure blob storage. It is then going to get a blob client for the JSON file using that input key. It's going to download that blob content as a stream. It's going to read all bytes from the stream and decode them to UTF-8 string. And then it's going to parse the JSON string into a Python dictionary. Now, when looking for the actual URL within that file, this line right here is going to extract the first video URL from the JSON data. And then it's going to print processing that video. Now, down here in this file, it's going to print that it's downloading it. This line of code right here is going to make an HTTP GET request to download the video. Stream equals true for large files. So that will just help break down the processing of them. And then this is going to raise an error message if the download fails. And then this is going to load the downloaded video content into bytes IO object, where this is an in-memory binary stream. Then it's going to upload, it's going to print that it's uploading it to the blob storage, and then it's going to start to do it. So this is going to get a blob client for the output video using the output key. And then this is going to actually upload the video data to the blob storage and overwrite if the blob already exists. And then if we have any errors, they will print out here that it happened during the video processing itself. So we have stepped through all of the code, right? We didn't talk about requirements.txt. This is something that you will actually be installing when you set up your project. I'll talk about that when we go through the instructions. But what actually executes all this? So you could, if you wanted to debug, you could you could type in Python in your terminal and type in any of these files and they would run individually. Now you obviously need to run them in a correct order, right? Like you can't run fetch.py without doing create the storage account first. But you could individually type in Python all these files, or you could create a script that runs all of them. And that's what run all py does. All right, y'all. So run all is essentially going to be the script that executes all of the scripts in the proper order that we need. So first and foremost, we're going to import any of our sub processes. This is going to run any of those external scripts as sub processes. And then our time is going to add delays between the script execution. And then we're going to import all of our like delay settings from the config.py. So this is going to first and foremost set the initialized attempt counter at 0. So that means that this is no attempts have been made to actually run this information. And then this is going to loop until the maximum retry count is reached, which we have our retry set for 3 right now. So this sub process.run right here on line 12, this is going to execute the script using Python and check for any errors that may have. And then if there aren't any, it's going to return that the script was completed successfully. And then if there are any errors that occur right here, then obviously that's when we enter into our retry project and it'll tell us which script fails. This is going to be key for debugging. If you are facing any error messages, this error will show you where it is occurring and there's something within that file that is configured wrong, or it could be an environment variable that's pulling in that file that is configured wrong. So please use that to do your due diligence. Shout out to show me your DDs or show me your due diligence in the Discord group. Super helpful. Do your due diligence here. But cool. So step 1 is to create a storage account and update the .env with the new values. So it's going to go out and run that create storage account.py. It's going to wait for those resources to stabilize using that 60-second timer within the scripts that we have set. Then step 2 is going to be to run fetch.py. We're going to go out and get the API and save that JSON data to the blob storage. I've said that like 10,000 times. So at this point, if you don't know like that part, maybe I need to slow it down, or maybe I need to say it 10,001 times. But yes, fetch, go get the data and put it in a blob. And then last but not least, it's going to run process 1 video. So download the JSON, download the video, and then upload the video back into the blob storage. And if any of that fails, we will see that here. So cool. Now that we went through everything line by line, let's go ahead and jump into the instructions itself and walk through this. Now, definitely a lot of details and a lot of things to read through. So just slow down and take your time. I do an overview of what each file kind of does or consists of. I did include a Docker file because next week we'll be working with containers, but we aren't using that here within this setting. So there are some things that you need to do before we run the script. First and foremost, you can use this URL to find the exact sports highlight API we will be using, and you can set up your Rapid API account that will give you like an API key with the basic free plan. Like I said, NCAA highlights is what we're using. That is the collegiate level basketball program here in the United States, and it has just as much really attention and traction as the NBA itself. Now, once all of that is installed, you can run this in a few places. You can do it within the Azure CLI, or you can do it within Visual Studio Code like I will be doing. You want to make sure that you have Python set up. Git is what we'll use to clone the repo, which means like create a copy of my repo locally for you to use. And then you're going to want to make sure that you have an Azure account set up. There is some free options here for getting credits depending on what qualifies for you, or, you know, if you're a student or whatever. So I do show you guys how you can get your Azure account ID, because you will need to update your subscription ID in that .env file. But there's also a quick overview of the folder structure. So everything you can expect. This .git ignored just ignores the .env file because you don't want to check that in. Here's a copy of the technical diagram that we just kind of walked through. And I also included a translation from AWS to Azure itself. So this will show you what we used in the AWS project and then what we are using in the Azure service. Now, one thing to note that is super cool is we are not, well, not super cool. Why did I even say that? I think I was going to talk about authentication. One thing to note here, though, is that we are not converting. In the AWS lab, we did a media convert where we like enhanced the audio, enhanced the video. Azure deprecated their media services back in 2023, so we just removed that portion where we enhanced the video, but you'll still be able to retrieve your video from there. If you want to enhance the video, there's so many third-party apps that does that. I think you could probably do it like directly from like CapCut or something like that. Another thing that is cool is, like I said, authentication stumped a lot of you guys in previous labs. And so what actually is happening here is we're using Azure Identity Authentication implicitly, right? So the script uses that default Azure credentials with the parentheses to authenticate with Azure. So what this does is it's going to provide secure access to Azure services without hard coding any of our credentials, right? So the script is first going to check and see if you're logged into Azure via CLI, right? So that's AZ login within the CLI or within the shell terminal. If you're running an Azure VM, it can use managed identity. If you're running it locally, it'll fall back to whatever Azure CLI credentials you are using. So instead of having to create all these different, like, we call them like RBAC roles, you can just use your credentials here to get the proper access. So it saves some time for some people who are new and don't really understand like the whole least privilege access thing. But anyways, this shows you how they can convert over from a service perspective, and then also what is the purpose of it. Now, we don't use AWS Lambda or functions in this specific lab, but you can use it in the future if you wanted to do some automation. Now, the first thing you'll do is you'll go out and you'll clone the repo locally. So if you just copy this and clone it, assuming you are logged into Git, it will create an exact copy and you can change directory to the source folder. You're going to want to go and update all of these things listed here. So your rapid API key, we went over all of this earlier, so I'm not going to harp on that. But after you do that, you want to make sure you run this line to secure the .env file itself. So now that we have all that done, we're actually going to set up a Python virtual environment. I posted 2 different scripts depending on if you're using Mac or Windows, but this creates the environment and then activates it. And then we are going to install all of the project dependencies there. So we're going to make sure that we install pip or upgrade to pip. And then we're going to actually install all of the things within the requirements.txt file before running. And then last but not least, we do Python run all, right? That's going to execute all of the files that we just talked about. And then after that, you can either run this within the CLI or within the terminal to confirm that the contents have loaded to the container, or we could jump into the UI, right? So if you come up here and you type in the storage account ID that was output in your terminal, you'll see it like down in the terminal output. You could also search for like the container name that you came up with. You'll see in there, okay, there we go. You'll see a highlights and you'll see videos. If you go to the highlights folder, this just has the JSON file. Let's download that and open it so you guys can see what that looks like. This is an example here. So you have like an ID, a type if it's verified. This is the URL that we're actually going out and getting. And then it does include like a title with a quick description. So as you can see, it's a few different videos here. I think we set it limited to either 5 or 10. But that's kind of what the JSON data looks like, right? Like it's not actually giving us the video. It's giving us where we could go and find the video there. Now, once we have the JSON file though, we run the process one video file to then go and grab this guy, which is the first video MP4, and we download that. Let's open that bad boy up. And this is a different video than what we did on the AWS side, but boom, you have a basketball game highlight. Oh, it won. All right, cool. So that is a way that you can go within the UI and find that. Now, there are different things you can learn about blob storage. That's pretty cool. You have like hot storage and cold storage. So hot storage is obviously going to be more expensive because you are getting access to that like data like faster. Cold storage are things you aren't accessing as frequently. And it does cost a little less to use cold storage. So I'll link some videos below that kind of talk about blobs and using them and the storage things. So that actually concludes week 2 of our Azure NCAA highlight processor. Feel free to drop any questions below. Make sure you are also in the Discord. Soon we'll be launching how we are going to be giving away 50 certifications. I kid you not. 50 certifications. In March, I'm actually going to be going live with you all, and we're going to be studying for at least 1 hour. I'm going to take a certification with you guys. We're going to study all of March, and then the first week of April, we are all going to go out and get certified because they expire April 15th. So super excited to knock this thing out the park with you guys and get educated. Leave any feedback. I hope you appreciated this one. And side note, before we go, can we just all like admire this Lego set that I built? Like, this is a G-Wagon. So I just copped a new G-Wagon. Shout out to me. You see me in the driver's seat. Really just took the roof off. This is an exclusive wagon. But yeah, I mean, I just want to like really just take a moment to say like Legos is something I recently started dabbling in, as in like this is my first one ever built. But it was pretty cool. Like, it has a little Mercedes-Benz emblem on the back and all that. Let me know what y'all favorite Lego set is. Let me know what y'all rate this one. And yeah, let's continue to take over the cloud together, one project at a time.